Your Honor, we actually can't hear you at the moment. I believe you may be on mute.
You know what? I did put myself on mute momentarily. Give me just a moment.
Your Honor, I think that you just muted yourself.
Outstanding. Oh, I see.
Perfect.
It's a little counterintuitive. Command-Shift-A to unmute. All right. So let's go on the record in the matter of the people versus Bassett. Could I get appearances starting with the government?
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon. My name is Bree Goodchild, and I am joined with my co-counsel, Mr. Keen Nolan.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
And today we represent the people.
Afternoon. And could I get appearances for defense?
Good afternoon, Your Honor. My name is Sydney Gaskins. I'm here today with my co-counsel, Mr. Ethan Hudson.
Hello, Your Honor.
Together, we
Hello.
represent the defendant in today's case, Ms. Kara Bassett.
All right. And give me just a moment while I look to see if there are any other special instructions. But while I'm doing that, why don't I get any preliminary matters? And again, we'll start with the government.
Yes, Your Honor. First, we would just like to draw the court's attention to pretrial orders both 7 and 6. Now, what these orders state is that there are a multitude of exhibits throughout today's proceedings, 4 through 33, that have already been entered into evidence. Now, throughout today's trial, we've already been given permission to show these to the jury at any point without specifically laying the foundation for those exhibits.
And Ms. Gaskins, I believe that that's the case. You agree as far as the exhibits, they've all been previously admitted?
Yes, Your Honor.
All right. Any other preliminary matters from the government?
Yes, Your Honor. We would like to ask your permission, when we are laying foundation for witnesses that are not already in evidence, for us to be able to show those on the screen so the witnesses we're working with can properly lay the foundation and identify those documents. We would ask to then be able to publish to the jury so that they would see the documents as well.
And I think that with our physical spacing limitations or our social distancing limitations, that's going to be a necessary way for us to do it. Ms. Gaskins, any objection?
No objection, Your Honor.
All right. Any other preliminaries from the government?
Just one more, Your Honor. We would just like to invoke Rule 615 that calls for the constructive sequestrations for all witnesses, save party representatives. And today the government has no representatives.
All right. And we'll consider all witnesses constructively sequestered. And that concludes preliminaries for the government.
That's correct, Your Honor. We're ready for openings.
Thank you. And Ms. Gaskins, any preliminary matters from the defense?
No, Your Honor. We're ready to go with opening statements.
All right, then let's start with opening statements from the United States.
Members of the jury. Kara Bassett is alone in a Florida swamp. The sky is dark. The air is hot and sticky. The bugs and critters are chirping so loud she can barely hear herself think. But she waits. She wants to watch with her own 2 eyes as her husband's body sinks deep into the muddy water, to make sure that he won't resurface, to make sure that she won't get caught. So the defendant waits until the body of Don Clark disappears for good. Because she knows once she goes home, she'll have everything she ever wanted. You're going to hear today that this kill was calculated. But how did we get here? Members of the jury, today you're going to get the chance to learn about an unusual couple. The defendant, Kara Bassett, and her husband, Don Clark. Now, the 2 of them met and got married back in 2011 and opened up the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park. a place where Florida residents could visit to see elephants up close and personal. And while the couple was dedicated to the mission, you're going to hear today that they had drastically different ideas on how to run. You're going to hear today that the defendant, elephants weren't just a passion. They were her life. And that she would go to any means necessary to change the way they were being treated by her husband. So she hatched a plan. You're going to hear today that in May of 2017, the defendant created a power of attorney for her husband and put in a specific clause to ensure that if he was ever to disappear, well, she would get everything. Now, I don't just mean the money and the house. She would get exactly what she wanted. Complete control of the elephant park. So she would be able to put into plan the changes she had been begging and fighting with her husband about for years. You're going to hear she took matters into her own hands. Today, you're going to get the chance to meet Agent Johnson, the lead investigator for the FBI who looked into the disappearance of Don Clark. Agent Johnson's going to be able to walk you through the events of August 18th of 2017. The day where Mr. Clark disappeared. He'll be able to tell you how when he was investigating their home, he found evidence that Mr. Clark had been drugged with an elephant tranquilizer. Something enough to sedate a grown beast and certainly enough to kill a grown man. Agent Johnson's going to be able to tell you how his body was then taken 140 miles away and disposed of in a swamp. A place that Agent Johnson will tell you was connected to the defendant through physical, tangible evidence. Now, as the state in today's case, it's not enough for us to tell you that Mr. Clark was murdered by his wife. Today, we're going to prove it. As the government, we take on something called the burden of proof, meaning that throughout today's trial, we'll have to show you that the only logical explanation for why Mr. Clark isn't with us today is because of the defendant's actions. And while this burden is high, it's one we're confident that we'll meet. So throughout today's trial, I want you to listen in for some of the key pieces of evidence that we're going to focus on. I want you to watch to see who would have access to the elephant tranquilizer who could have killed Mr. Clark. I want you to listen in for who was connected to the scene of the crime. Most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to listen to the motivations that the defendant had for harming her husband. Because while it might seem silly to you or I to hurt someone in our families just for some elephants, the evidence today is going to show you that the defendant would do anything for these animals. We're going to show you today that this kill was calculated. At the end of these trials, we'll review with you the facts, and we're going to ask you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. And my bailiff has been kind enough to remind me that scores should have their view on speaker view for the opening statements. I'm sorry I neglected to do that before the first opening statement. And is the defense giving an opening statement at this time or reserving?
We're ready.
Ms. Gaskins, anytime you want to start.
May it please the court. A moment ago, Miss Goodchild got up here and she told you that it might seem silly to believe that Kara Bassett killed her husband over some elephants. And the thing is, she's absolutely right. She had a lot of accusations against Miss Bassett. She had a lot of claims about her when she gave her opening statement. But what I want to do is I want to introduce you to Kara Bassett myself. Members of the jury, this is Kara Bassett. And what the evidence is going to show today is that she loved elephants, but so did her husband. Don Clark and Kara Bassett, they've been married for about 7 years now. And together they owned the elephant park. But what you're going to learn today is that about 3 years ago, something terrible happened to the both of them. Miss Bassett, she was in her house alone. She wakes up and her husband is missing. And what you're going to figure out today is that nobody, not the government, not Miss Goodchild, not the FBI, and certainly not Miss Bassett, has any idea what actually happened to Don Clark the night he disappeared. Because you see, when you listen to the government's evidence, you're going to have a lot more questions than you have answers to. So I'm going to ask you to keep 3 questions in mind, things to think about as we listen to the evidence. Where is Don Clark? Can they even prove that Don Clark is actually dead? A second, why did the government not investigate any other potential possibilities or suspects? And third, where is the evidence that Miss Bassett even had anything to do with her husband's disappearance? You see, what this case really comes down to is one simple thing. The government, they chose their answer before they asked the questions. Now, Miss Goodchild, when she walked into this courtroom today, she was the one who decided to accuse Miss Bassett of killing her own husband. And I don't have to tell you that that's a serious allegation. It's not something to play about, and that's why the law requires her to prove it to you beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the highest burden in our criminal justice system. And she's not going to be able to meet it today. Now, as a defense, we don't have a burden, but we are going to call a witness. Today, we're going to call Joe Kwong, a TV producer who was making a documentary about Kara Bassett and her husband. It was going to be called The Elephant Queen. Mr. Kwong is going to tell you 2 important things about the FBI investigation in this case. First, he's going to tell you that he had over 2,000 hours worth of footage of Don Clark leading up to his disappearance, and the FBI, well, they never even bothered to take a look at it. Second, Joe Kwong, he's going to tell you about alternate suspects that could have had something to do with Don Clark's death. People who were in contact with him the day that he disappeared, that the FBI never even bothered to take a look at. Now, at the end of today's trial, I'm going to speak with you again. And I'm going to walk you through the evidence, but I want you to remember something. Miss Bassett, she walked in this courtroom today with something different than Miss Goodchild. She walked in with something called the presumption of innocence. And what that means is when you find that there are gaps in the government's case, unanswered questions that you have about what really happened to Don Clark that night, you have to presume that Miss Bassett is innocent. And she's going to wear that presumption of innocence from the beginning of this trial to the middle to the end, because Miss Goodchild won't meet her burden. Because she and the government, they chose their answer before they asked the questions. I'm going to ask you to find Miss Bassett not guilty of murder. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Ms. Gaskins. And again, I'm going to ask everybody to make sure that you're on mute if you are not one of the 2 attorneys who are presenting today. And I want to remind our scorers at this time to move to gallery view for the presentation of evidence. And counsel, give me just a moment so that I have the right document up beside me as we go to the presentation of evidence. All right, I believe that gives everybody enough time to switch over, and I now have my materials up. And Ms. Goodchild, you ready to call your first witness?
Yes, Your Honor. At this time, the people call Agent Steph Johnson to the stand.
And
Good
we will
afternoon.
deem, we'll deem Mr. Johnson sworn as a witness, and you can commence your direct examination. Sorry for the interruption.
My apologies, Your Honor. Good afternoon, sir. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Yes, ma'am. Good afternoon. My name is Special Agent Steph Johnson.
What do you do as a special agent?
Well, I work for the FBI out of our Jacksonville office. I'm a senior special agent, and I'm actually in our violent crimes division. So it's a lot of investigating murders, gang activity, organized crime. It's a lot of that work.
How long have you been working for the FBI?
I've been working with the bureaus since 2002. I've been a special agent for the last 8 years.
Agent Johnson, can you tell us about any specialized training you've received?
Yes, of course, every FBI special agent goes through an 800-hour course. And every year I get specialized training in evidence collection, witness interrogation, and general criminal procedure.
All right, well, Agent Johnson, I'd like to turn your attention to the investigation about Don Clark. Can you tell us your involvement in this case?
Sure, I was the lead investigator in that case. I was the one who made the recommendation for a criminal charge about a year after it ended.
Well, who is Don Clark?
Don Clark was one of the owners of an elephant sanctuary here in the Tallahassee area.
When did you learn that Mr. Clark had gone missing?
It was August 25th, 2017. Our field office received a missing persons call, and that call came from Mr. Clark's wife, a woman named Kara Bassett.
All right, well, sir, I want to walk through the steps you took in your investigation. Now, you told us that that you received information that he was missing on the 25th. Did you learn if that was the day he had disappeared?
Yeah, I learned that that wasn't the day he had disappeared. He
When-
actually Sorry, go ahead.
No, please continue, sir. When did you learn Mr. Clark had disappeared?
When we spoke to Miss Bassett, she said her husband had actually disappeared a full week before that, August 18th.
Well, once you had this information, how did your investigation proceed?
Well, at that point, we wanted to learn everything we could about the whereabouts of Mr. Clark. And the defendant actually told us that she knew where Mr. Clark's van was, that it was at a local airport. So we proceeded there to search the van for evidence.
Did you find anything?
We did. We actually found two types of evidence. First, we had GPS data from the internal computer of the van, and we also had forensic evidence from the interior of the vehicle.
Well, let's start with that GPS evidence. Can you tell us what you were able to do with that?
Sure. So the way that GPS on that specific van works is whether you turn it on or not for directions, it's always tracking the van's location. So looking at what happened August 18th, early morning of August 19th, we were able to track its motions.
All right, well, Agent Johnson, where did the car start that day?
That van started at 11:17 p.m. on the 18th from the elephant sanctuary where Mr. Clark and Miss Bassett lived.
Where did the van go?
For about the next 2 hours, it drove to Big Gum Swamp.
Sir, what time did the van arrive there?
1:26 a.m.
Did you see if the van ever left Big Gum Swamp?
Yes, ma'am. The van was idle there for 44 minutes, and at 2:10 a.m., it left the swamp.
Where did the van go?
For the next 2 hours, it drove back towards Tallahassee, ending at a private airport near the sanctuary called Carrie Bell Leon International Airport. It arrived there at 4:29, and from that point till the time our agents found the van, it didn't move. It had been abandoned.
Agent Johnson, I want to talk a bit more about Big Gum Swamp. Did you have any indication that the defendant had gone to this location?
We did actually. Like I said earlier, there were forensics inside the van and forensics we found on the defendant's property. We tested those against the swamp and we got some very important results.
Well, I want to break that down a little bit, sir. How were you able to test these samples?
Well, we found something unusual when we looked in the floorboard of that van. We found mud that had algae in it. In fact, it was a very distinctive combination of algae. It meant that we could test it against other property.
When you tested this algae from the van to the defendant, what did you find?
We found that they matched. So then the next question is, where could that combination of algae come from?
Well, did it match anything else in your investigation?
It did. My agents took 3 different samples from Big Gum Swamp, and we found the exact same combination of algae. It's important to note that that combination of algae is very, very rare. Think of it as almost like the signature of that swamp. So that really, really narrowed down where the defendant had been.
Did you ever ask the defendant if she had been to the swamp?
Yes, ma'am. Of course, in an investigation, we want to presume the most innocent possibility. So we asked her, have you ever been to that swamp for any reason? And she denied ever having gone.
All right, well, Agent Johnson, I want to turn your attention to what could have happened to Dawn Clark on August 18th. When you searched the defendant's house, did you find any evidence of a potential weapon that could have been used to harm her husband?
We did. So the defendant lives on an elephant preserve, and we found in a storage cabinet that was locked syringes of a drug called carfentanil.
Sir, can you tell us a bit more about what carfentanil is?
Sure. Carfentanil is a tranquilizer used to put out elephants while they're being treated medically. And so, of course, 1 syringe of carfentanil, that's plenty to knock out an elephant, which weighs many times what a human weighs. So a syringe of carfentanil, even a few drops, can be lethal for a human.
Did you find any evidence that this carfentanil had been used in this case?
Yes, ma'am. There was a logbook with the
Objection to
carfentanil.
lack of personal knowledge, may I be heard?
Yes.
The question that I'm objecting to is Ms. Goodchild's question as to whether this investigator found that a syringe of carfentanil was used in the case. And then as I waited for the witness's answer, the witness said yes. But under Rule 602, that's not admissible because there's absolutely no way, and no way for Ms. Goodchild to lay any foundation for this investigator to know whether carfentanil was actually used in this case.
May I respond, Your Honor?
Yes.
The witness we're talking with is the lead investigator in the death of Dawn Clark. Now, what he was about to go into was how there was actually a vial of carfentanil that was missing from the defendant's property that she could not account for herself. Now, this is being used to show that there was a possible weapon that was used to harm Mr. Clark. He certainly has the personal knowledge to explain how this missing drug fit into the investigation itself.
May I respond?
Yes.
What Ms. Goodchild just said is that she's going to lay foundation on the record that there was a bottle of missing carfentanil. But even with that foundation, that's not even good enough for this investigator to take that extra leap in logic and say that because there was a missing bottle of carfentanil, it must have been used in this case. In order for him to be able to testify to that, we would have to know when this bottle of carfentanil went missing, who took this bottle of carfentanil out of its place. And we have a good faith basis to believe that Ms. Goodchild will not be able to lay an ounce of that foundation.
May I respond, Your Honor?
And Ms. Goodchild, you're the proffering party. I'll give you one last chance to respond, and that'll be the end of the argument on this particular objection.
Ms. Gaskins' argument goes to weight, not admissibility. As the government, we don't need to provide direct evidence for each and every portion of today's trial. We're allowed to show the jury circumstantial evidence. The fact that there was a deadly drug that the defendant had access to that was mysteriously missing by the time her husband had disappeared is circumstantial evidence to show that the defendant would have had a means to commit this crime. We don't need to lay the direct evidence for this to hold relevant value for the jury. And this witness's personal knowledge on how he uncovered that evidence is certainly admissible.
That's absolutely true, although that wasn't the question you asked the witness. The question was the carfentanil used in this case? And I don't think that the witness can lay foundation for that. If you want to lay foundation based on his personal knowledge as to whether he discovered any, whether the vial appeared to be missing some contents, whether the syringe had liquid inside of it, something along those lines, I think this witness can testify to that. However, saying that it was used or not used may be a conclusion that the jury could draw, but definitely not something to which this witness would have for which this witness would have personal knowledge. So I'll sustain the objection. The answer is stricken. The jury is instructed to disregard, and the government can resume its questioning.
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Johnson, during your search of the defendant's home, did you find any types of poisons there?
Yes, in a locked cabinet, I found 23 vials of, like I said, a deadly drug called carfentanil.
Were you able to speak with the defendant about how much of this carfentanil she had on hand?
Yes. I noticed that there was a logbook which noted that there were supposed to be 24 vials of the carfentanil. So there was one unidentified, one that was unaccounted for. And when I asked her about them, she didn't have an explanation for where that vial had gone.
All right, well, sir, I want to turn your attention to what happened after Mr. Clark went missing. After your initial investigation in August of 2017, did you continue to speak with the defendant?
Of course. We spoke to her a lot over the course of that year, wanted to collect as much evidence as we could.
Were you able to speak with the defendant on how her elephant park might have changed?
I was.
Well, what kind of changes did the defendant tell you about?
The defendant told us that prior to her husband's disappearance, her husband had had control over how the park ran, and that she disagreed with a lot of Mr. Clark's methods. For example, she felt that letting people ride the elephants and locking them in cages, that was cruelty, but Mr. Clark insisted on doing that.
Did she tell you about any changes she made after her husband disappeared?
Yes, she said that with her husband gone, she turned the park into a sanctuary as she had wanted, let people go further away from the elephants, let the elephants out of the cages.
And when was that, sir?
That was in October.
Great. Thank you for your time, Agent Johnson. I have nothing further at this time, Your Honor.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. Cross-examination, Ms. Gaskins.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Agent Johnson.
Good afternoon, ma'am.
I want to start by talking about your search of Don Clark's property, okay?
Sure.
You and your team looked for blood, didn't you?
That's right, as we would at every scene.
You looked for signs of violence, didn't you?
Yes, signs of struggle, specifically.
At Don Clark's property, you didn't find any of that, did you?
Not on the property, no, ma'am.
You also searched the swamp, didn't you?
That's right, although it's basically impossible to search every square inch of a swamp as big as Big Gum.
You're right, it's about 13,000 square miles, right?
Right, it's as though if a body was dumped in the Everglades, asking an officer if they had searched the entirety of the Everglades. It's very, very difficult to canvass every square mile of that.
Well, you still tried, didn't you?
Of course. This is a slow, meticulous process. Conducting a criminal investigation takes time, and we took advantage of the year we spent.
We'll get to your investigation in a moment, but right now I'm going to ask you about what you looked for at that swamp, okay?
Sure, that was an important part of the investigation.
You looked for Don Clark's body.
Of course.
You brought dogs with you.
Search dogs, yes, ma'am.
Those dogs are trained, right?
Yes, ma'am.
They're trained to detect the human scent, right?
Right.
They're trying to find a human, dead or alive. Isn't that true?
That's right.
After your canvass of the swamp, you didn't find any evidence of Don Clark's body there, did you?
Right. Miss Bassett's delay in reaching out to us certainly made that search much more difficult. We weren't able to find either the body or the syringe, which we believe to be the murder weapon.
Well, sir, that's a yes to my question. At the swamp, you didn't find any evidence that Don Clark was ever there, right?
We had the GPS data, ma'am. That was a key piece of evidence, but no physical evidence at the swamp, if that's what you're asking.
Well, you don't have a forensic report to prove he's dead, do you?
No, ma'am, but the state of Florida has legally declared him dead.
You don't have an autopsy, do you?
No, ma'am, you can't conduct an autopsy when the body's been disposed of.
You don't have an eyewitness that saw him die, do you?
No, ma'am.
Sir, it's been 3 years and you still haven't found the body. Isn't that a fact?
Right, and I can tell you from my years testifying in cases, that's actually not that rare in a murder case that the body is successfully disposed of. That's why we rely on other evidence when we're determining who committed that crime.
Well, sir, I'm not asking you if it's rare or not. I'm simply asking you, it's been 3 years and your team has still not found the body, right?
Right. At this point, the body is certainly decayed. There would be nothing to find, even if someone pinpointed the exact location for us right now.
So you stopped looking.
Ma'am, we stopped looking about 1.5 years ago. Really, a month or two after someone dies, especially in an area like that swamp, searching for the body is no longer a viable strategy.
Sir, I'm going to redirect you back to my question. It was very simple. You stopped looking, didn't you?
Right, ma'am, because the body wouldn't exist in any recognizable form at this point. It would be a waste of your money, be a waste of taxpayer dollars. It wouldn't get us any closer to justice.
Okay, Agent Johnson, let's talk about something else. Mr. Hudson, can you throw Exhibit 21 up on the screen? Agent Johnson, you recognize this document, don't you?
Yes, ma'am. These are the phone records of Don Clark.
You took a look at these documents in the course of your investigation, right?
Yes, ma'am.
I want to focus specifically on the 4th phone call that Don Clark received. This phone call was from somebody in Costa Rica, wasn't it?
It was to someone in Costa Rica, ma'am. It was an outgoing call.
That person was in Costa Rica?
Yes, it was an unlisted number.
Don Clark talked to this person in Costa Rica on August 18th, 2017. Yes or no?
Yes, it says so right there.
6:00 p.m., right?
Yep, and it lasted for 52 minutes.
This is just a couple hours before Don Clark allegedly disappeared, right?
Yes, ma'am.
So the truth of the matter is, you have no idea who this phone number even belongs to. Isn't that right?
Right, it's an unlisted number, so there's no way of tracking that, ma'am.
You have no idea why someone in Costa Rica was trying to contact the victim the same evening that he disappeared.
Well, it was Mr. Clark who was trying to contact them, but no, I don't know why he was calling to Costa Rica.
You don't have an alibi for this person, do you?
No, ma'am, we don't know if this is a person or a company. It's a number that Mr. Clark called in Costa Rica.
That's a no.
Right. We don't even know if it's a single person is what I'm saying. When it's an unlisted number, we have basically no further information to go on. But given travel time from Costa Rica to Florida, we were pretty sure that wasn't the person who killed Mr. Clark.
Well, sir, let's move on to something else. Let's go to the second call on that document, okay? This call is from Lisa Clark, right?
That's right.
Lisa Clark is Don Clark's ex-wife, true?
Yes, ma'am.
Don Clark was in contact with Lisa Clark the same day he disappeared. Isn't that right?
That's right, for 4 minutes.
They had a 4-minute conversation just a couple hours before he allegedly disappeared, right?
Yes, about 6 hours before.
Now, Agent Johnson, the truth of the matter is you don't have an alibi for Lisa Clark either, do you?
That's right. We had no reason to think Lisa Clark was involved in this crime, but we don't know exactly where she was that night, ma'am.
Well, you tried to interview her, didn't you?
That's right. We wanted to get more information about Mr. Clark. Lisa Clark was once married to him. We thought she'd be a useful source for information.
You told Lisa Clark, I want to ask you some questions about Don Clark's disappearance. That's what you asked her, right?
Right. Wanted to know more about Don generally, where he might be hiding, if he had left somewhere, kind of what was important to him, if he had any conflict she was aware of.
Sir, Lisa Clark refused to cooperate with your investigation, didn't she?
She declined an interview. Yes, ma'am.
She's the only person in your entire investigation who refused to cooperate with you. Isn't that true?
Refused to be interviewed? Yes, ma'am.
And now, since you don't have an alibi for Lisa Clark, you have no idea where she was the night that Don Clark disappeared. Yes or no?
That's not exactly right, ma'am. That's not exactly right.
She didn't give you an alibi.
No, ma'am, but we do have a reasonably good idea of where Miss Clark wasn't.
Well, sir, I'm not asking you about your reasonably good idea. I'm simply asking you about the facts. And the facts are Lisa Clark didn't talk to you, right?
That's right, but the fact that there was no forensic evidence connecting Lisa Clark to the swamp, to the van, to any murder weapon, gives us a good idea that she wasn't at the swamp or in that van.
Well, sir, we'll get to the forensic evidence in a moment, but right now I'm just talking about Lisa Clark and when you talk to her. The truth of the matter is you don't know where she was, right?
Again, ma'am, that's not exactly right. You're right that Lisa Clark didn't talk to us, but we do have a reasonably good idea where she wasn't. And
well,
that's
sir,
part
you're
of
telling me
understanding.
where she wasn't, but I'm just asking you, you don't know where she was, right?
Exactly where she was? No, ma'am, we can't pinpoint her. We know her phone call came from Orlando, so we could say the greater Orlando area or driving distance from Orlando. But beyond that, all we can tell you is that she most likely was not in that van or at that swamp.
You also don't have alibis for 3 of the employees who worked on the property. Isn't that a fact?
That's right, ma'am. We had no reason to believe any of those witnesses had any animus against Mr. Clark, but we don't know exactly where they were.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Happy to help.
And Ms. Goodchild, I saw a note from you in the chat, but I'm not exactly sure what it meant.
Yes, Your Honor. Per the limitations of this trial, we're only allotted a certain amount of time for our different roles. We were just alerting you that Ms. Gaskins unfortunately had gone over time, but obviously the situation has handled itself now. So, but we would
Thank you.
redirect of the witness, Your Honor.
And just before we leave the topic, Ms. Gaskins, did you want to respond to the time issue?
I wasn't overtime.
All right. We'll come back to that issue in a little bit. I'll confer with my bailiff and see about that. And while we do that, we'll go to redirect for the government.
Agent Johnson, can you tell us why you didn't do further investigations on Lisa Clark?
Yeah, we found no reason to believe that Lisa Clark was connected to this crime in terms of means. No access to the weapon, no forensic evidence found in the vehicle that we believe was used to transport Mr. Clark, no connection to the swamp. There was no reason to rise her to the level of suspect based on what we found over the course of our investigation, ma'am.
Thank you, sir. I have nothing further.
Your Honor, we can't hear you.
And for some reason, my spacebar stopped working to unmute myself. And I don't know whether this jurisdiction allows recross, Ms. Goodchild.
Yes, Your Honor, recross is an option if Ms. Gaskins so chooses.
All right. And Ms. Gaskins, any recross?
No recross, Your Honor.
All right. Can we excuse the...
Yes, Your Honor. And at this time, we'd also like to rest our case in chief.
All right. Thank you, sir, for your testimony. You can step down, or I guess that's a figurative step down. And if you'd be kind enough to turn your video camera off, and then the government having rested, before you start with your first witness, anything else, Ms. Gaskins?
No, Your Honor, we're ready to call our first witness.
All right, go ahead.
We call Joe Kwong to the stand. Good afternoon. Could you please introduce yourself to the members of the jury?
Hello there. My name is Joe Kwong.
What do you do for a living?
I like to make all kinds of art. Mainly, I produce films. I take real life and capture them in moments in order to put them up on the silver screen.
What types of films do you usually make?
Well, my main forte is documentaries. However, I'm hoping I can try and get into the movie biz.
How did you get involved in this case?
Well, it was in 2015, I believe, when a Miss Kara Bassett contacted me about coming to film at their zoo.
What happened next?
Well, I decided to come and I decided I was going to film and partake in what they were doing. We were doing an entire documentary about everything that goes on there between her, Don, the elephants, their staff, everything I could gather.
And what were your responsibilities when you were working at the park?
Oh, just to film as much as possible, anything that I could. Any interactions with the animals, with the guests, between employees, especially with the elephants. It was very, very important for them.
How long did you work there?
For years. I started immediately in 2015 and I was recording every single day up until 2018.
Did you get to know Don and Lisa Bassett pretty well?
Of course, I was recording for thousands of hours at a time and they were the two main people of the documentary.
How would you describe their relationship?
Pretty normal, I would say. They were a married couple, you know, they had their little arguments, they were cute with each other, they went on dates, things like that.
And do you remember where you were on August 18th, 2017?
Yes, I was doing interviews at the park there. We were doing one-on-one segments about interaction with the animals with the guests.
Were you able to talk to Don and Lisa that day?
Yes, actually, yes. I was with Kara most of the day, but I was able to speak to Don as well.
Did you notice anything unusual about Don and Lisa's relationship that day?
About Don and Lisa?
Oh, excuse me, Don and Kara.
Well, not that day, no. It seemed to be a normal day for them.
Well, speaking of Lisa, I want to ask you about another person. Did you ever see anybody else frequently come to the park?
Well, yeah, Lisa is one of the only people who would frequent the park, and she never actually wanted to take a tour.
Well, can we take a step back? Who is Lisa Clark?
As far as I know, she used to be married to Don. I believe that's his ex-wife.
How would you describe their interactions when she would come to the park?
It was actually pretty scary. It was always really hostile. She would come and stand at the gate for hours, yelling and screaming obscenities at him. One time she told him she was going to wipe him off the face of the earth.
Objection under 404, character evidence, Your Honor.
And first I'll hear from Ms. Goodchild and then from Ms. Gaskins.
Yes, Your Honor. Opposing counsel is going into a specific instance of conduct on the part of Lisa Clark, where on a past instance, she was aggressive, hostile, and threatened Don Clark. Now, they're using this evidence for conformity, that on the day in question, the person who harmed Mr. Clark was in fact his ex-wife. That's improper character evidence under 404B.
May I respond?
Yes, Ms. Gaskins.
Rule 404B absolutely does not apply here. Rule 404B deals with crimes, wrongs, or other acts. And it states that evidence of a person's crime, wrong, or other act cannot be used to prove character, and thus to prove that a person acted in accordance with that character on a specific occasion. Now, we just have a quote on the record. This is not a crime, this is not a wrong, and this is not an action. It's a statement.
Your Honor, may I respond?
Give me just a moment, and I'm going to ask both counsel. I promise I will address you, but especially in a video conference like this, please give the other person the courtesy of making sure that they're finished with their argument before you start speaking. Ms. Gaskins, were you finished?
I was finished.
Yes, Ms. Goodchild, you may respond.
The entire interaction that Mr. Kwong just described is a specific instance of conduct. 404B does not require this conduct to be a crime or some kind of illegal action. It's any specific moment that can be used for conformity and propensity purposes. The interaction of Lisa Clark arriving to the elephant park, threatening her husband and trying to harm him or threatening to, is used for that propensity purpose to show that that's what happened on August 18th of 2017. That's why it's inadmissible under 404B.
May I respond?
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. And yes, Ms. Gaskins, you're the proffering party. I'll give you the last word before I.
Ms. Goodchild only objected after we put the statement on the record that Lisa Clark said that she was going to wipe Don Clark off the face of the planet. Now, if Ms. Goodchild is alleging that the action of Lisa Clark coming to the park is being offered for propensity purposes, that still doesn't apply under Rule 404B. Like I said a moment ago, Rule 404B deals with crimes, wrongs, or other acts. But Ms. Goodchild is objecting to a particular statement that she's trying to keep out that hurts her case.
For what purpose, Ms. Gaskins, are you offering this evidence?
We're offering the statement that Lisa Clark said that she was going to wipe Don Clark off the face of the planet to show Lisa's intent to wipe Don Clark off the face of the planet, therefore to go to our alternate suspect defense.
All right. 404B allows other acts evidence. I'm going to disagree with Ms. Gaskins. This is other acts evidence. 404A says that, and Ms. Goodchild is correct that it does not need to be another crime. The title of the section, or I should say the rule, has no effect on the interpretation. This is another act. However, I don't believe that the defense is offering for the purpose of propensity or to show an act in accordance with conduct and conformity. Rather, a person who might have the desire to do some harm to the alleged victim in this case. So for that reason, I'll allow the testimony. I'll instruct the jury that they're allowed to consider it only for the limited purpose of showing possible motive or intent on behalf of third-party culpability, or I should say for a third-party culpability theory. Objections overruled.
What did you hear Lisa Clark say to Don Clark?
She was shouting at him, and she said that she was going to wipe him off the face of the earth. Someone had to call the police on her.
Mr. Kwong, I want to ask you about something else now. The FBI investigation. When did you first learn about it?
Well, I had gone to Mexico for about a week or so, and the day that I got back, around the 26th of August, they were already at the park.
Did you interact with them?
Well, yes, very briefly. They asked me who I was and what I was doing, but that was it.
So let me ask you, how many hours of footage would you say you had when the FBI was conducting their investigation?
Oh, ma'am, I don't like to toot my own horn as like a Kubrick type, but we had over 2,000 hours of film.
What was that film of?
As I said earlier, everything I could film at the park, all the interactions with the animals, between the workers, the employees, between Kara and her husband, pretty much anything that I thought needed to be captured, which was everything, was captured.
Did the FBI ever ask to see that footage?
No, not one time. I even had my camera on me, and they never asked me about it. Even when I told them, they still said they didn't need to see it.
Did they ever ask you any questions at all about that footage you had?
No, the only thing they asked me were just what I was doing there and if I'd seen anything, and that was it.
Are you familiar with elephant tranquilizers?
I'm not a veterinarian or anything. However, I do know of the medical supplies that they kept in a storage closet at the park.
What do you know about that storage closet with the elephant tranquilizers?
Well, I know that it has a log of these tranquilizers that are used to sedate the elephants whenever there's a medical issue or anything needs to be done.
Do you know how many people you saw have access to this storage?
I saw at least a dozen people go in and out of that closet from time to time.
Did you ever see the FBI go in that closet?
Yes, actually, yes. There was a time when I saw one of the agents go in and was fumbling around with some of the syringes, but he got yelled at because he didn't have gloves on.
Now, Mr. Kwong, I want to really focus on Don Clark now. Were you able to get to know him when he was there?
Absolutely. Don, the moment I got to the park and started filming, Don and I hit it off. We even went out a couple of times.
What were you able to learn about Don Clark?
He's just an overall great guy. He likes to travel, flies his own plane, even goes to Costa Rica from time to time.
Costa Rica. What do you know about Don Clark in Costa Rica?
I know that that's one of the main places that he would fly to on his own. He would go in his little plane, he would take off and go. I think he had a vacation home there.
Did you ever go to his vacation home in Costa Rica?
I did, yes. After everything had gone down, it had been about a year or so and still no real answers. So I decided to just go and try and check things out myself.
When you got to Don Clark's vacation home in Costa Rica, what did you see?
First of all, it was a really, really nice place. Everything was spotless, like it had been previously dusted. There were fans on, he had clothes hanging in the closet.
Now, Mr. Kwong, I want to ask you about a piece of evidence in this case. Mr. Hudson, can you throw up Exhibit 21 for us? Mr. Kwong, are you familiar with these telephones?
Shown these in an interview that I had.
Now, I want to focus on these telephone calls, number 4 specifically. What does this say?
It says that it was made on August 18th, 2017, to a number listed in San Jose, Costa Rica at about 6 p.m.
And Mr. Hudson, can you go to the next page of this document for me? I want to focus on the text messages 7 and 8. Where are these from?
These say that they're from the same number, again, listed to that same Costa Rica, San Jose.
And what time were they sent?
These were also sent right at 6 p.m.
Mr. Kwong, do you have any idea what Don Clark was doing at 6 p.m. on August 18th, 2017?
Yeah, we were talking at the time. I had just come back from doing an interview. We were speaking to each other, and then he got a text.
What happened after he got a text?
Well, 1 second he was telling me that he was going to see me later after he got back, and then he just went stone white. He was cold and just stormed away.
And when was the last time you saw him?
That was it. The color drained from his face, and I never saw him again.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you, Ms. Gaskins. Cross-examination, Ms. Goodchild.
Yes, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Kwong.
Hello.
No, you were just speaking with Ms. Gaskins about Lisa Clark, and I'd like to clarify a couple details about that interaction you told us about.
Okay.
Now, the day you saw Ms. Clark yell at her husband, that wasn't August 18th of 2017, right?
Well, no, that was several times, ma'am.
The time you told us about, that wasn't in August, was it?
It was, that specific time was about a couple months before. There were numerous months in between and after, though.
Now, you were at the Elephant Park on August 18th.
Yes, I was conducting my interviews and research as usual.
You were there from 9 in the morning till about 6 at night.
Correct. I was following an interview guest and talked to them about seeing the elephants free roaming.
During that time, you never saw Lisa Clark.
No, not that day.
You never saw her show up to the park.
Well, I was with Kara. I wasn't standing by the entrance.
Now, you actually were with Don Clark for a portion of that day, too.
Yeah, I was coming back from filming one of the interviews with the guests, and I ran into Don on my way to see Kara again.
Mr. Clark never told you that his ex-wife had shown up.
That's none of my business, ma'am.
To bring it back to my question, sir, when you were talking with Don Clark on August 18th, he never mentioned his ex-wife to you.
No, ma'am, I don't know why I would talk to him about his ex-wife.
He never told you that he was afraid of his ex-wife on the day he went missing.
On the day of? No, ma'am.
All right, now, sir, I'd like to direct your attention to the Elephant Park itself. I want to talk with you on what it was like before Don Clark went missing.
Okay.
In the summer of 2017, it was called the Greater Tallahassee Elephant Park.
Yeah, could have been a little bit better, but I guess.
People could pay money to see the elephants.
Yes.
They get up close and personal with them.
Yes.
They were able to do that because the elephants were kept in cages.
Well, I don't know why they would be able to do that because of the cages.
Sir, you saw the elephants kept in cages, correct?
Well, yes, ma'am, they were in cages, but I don't know if that would have affected how close people could have gotten to them.
And that's how the park ran when Don Clark was in charge.
Correct.
Now that's something that his wife, the defendant, complained to you about, right?
About how he ran the park, yes.
The defendant complained on how her husband treated the animals.
Yeah, Kara seemed to want more of a sanctuary vibe, a bit more open pastures.
Sir, I want to talk about one of those times the defendant complained to you. You remember taking footage of the defendant in June of 2017?
Yes, I was recording every single day. You have to be more specific, I'm sorry.
Of course, sir. Mr. Nolan, if you pull up Exhibit 36. Now, this is one of those interviews you did with the defendant, right?
Yes, this is an interview I did. You said where she was complaining?
We'll get to the context in a moment, sir. But this is an interview you conducted, right?
Correct, yes, that's Miss Bassett.
Your Honor, the people move Exhibit 36 into evidence.
No objection.
Your Honor, I believe you're still on mute.
My apologies, Your Honor. I believe that you muted yourself again. And I don't have the ability to directly unmute you, sorry.
Yes. And it doesn't need it freezes for a little while. So for some reason this starting to freeze, and my audio is getting a little bit garbled as well. So I apologize. And we've missed I don't know exactly what's going wrong with my connection here. I'm trying to get into a different area of the house and see if that improves things. I apologize, Council. And first, Mr. Child, thumbs up. You can hear me. I'm still getting no signal. I hate to do this, but I can see the chat. I can see a little bit of signal here, but I'm going to try seeing if I can. I'm going to ask everybody's forgiveness and see if I can get something going here.
Judge Lucky, your audio is now perfect again.
Oh, well, there's got to be one thing perfect. So First, I'll apologize to counsel, and we'll see if we can get a better connection going here. I don't know exactly what was happening, but my client was also freezing up. So in other words, when I would unmute myself, I would just get a beach ball for quite a while. So so it might be my computer overheating. In any event, I apologize. Ms. Goodchild had moved Exhibit 36 into evidence. I believe Ms. Gaskins said that she had no objection, but of course that was when my audio was breaking up. Is that correct, Ms. Gaskins?
Yes, Your Honor.
Outstanding. Then 36 is admitted, and I hope that while I was having technical difficulties, if anybody was timing, that they stopped the time. And Ms. Goodchild, I apologize for my technical difficulties, and you can continue examining the witness.
At this time, Your Honor, we'd like to play Exhibit 36 for the jury.
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm steaming. This is a business, not a charity. As long as it's my money, we'll run it that way. That's what Don said to me. Can you believe that? We'll see how this ends.
Mr. Kwong, I want to turn your attention to what the Elephant Park was like after Don Clark disappeared. Now, you'd agree with me that in October of 2017, the defendant took over the park.
Well, yes, Dawn was gone at that point. I would say she was already in charge, but that's when she formally just decided to be the owner.
She made some changes.
Of course, yes.
She let the elephants out of their cage.
Yes.
The park actually became an animal sanctuary.
In name, I guess.
Well, it was then called the Baby Elephant Sanctuary, right?
Yeah, that's why I said in name.
And she actually was able to do this relatively quickly.
Well, I wouldn't say that.
Let
Dawn,
me clarify for you, sir. Once the defendant took over the elephant park, that's when she turned it into the sanctuary, right?
well, yes, that's what she had wanted to do.
Now, after she did that, she told you that she had everything she had ever wanted.
Yes.
Now, sir, you'd agree with me that the defendant obviously cared about elephants.
Yes, that seemed to be her life's passion.
She told you the lengths she would go to help her animals.
Well, yeah, we talked frequently about how much she loved her animals and how much she really cared for them.
Let's talk about one of those times. Mr. Nolan, if you pull up Exhibit 38. Now, sir, this is another one of the interviews you did with the defendant.
Correct.
This happened a few months before her husband went missing.
I believe so. We had a number of interviews. This most likely seems from that time period.
This is from June of 2017.
I think so, yes. I can't tell exactly which video this is.
Your Honor, the people offer Exhibit 38 into evidence.
Any objection, Ms. Gaskins?
No objection, Your Honor.
38's admitted?
May we play for the jury?
Yes.
Mr. Nolan?
People look at me and they think I'm sweet and nice. Go on. Keep underestimating me. I will lobby senators. I will protest big businesses. I will get in your face. I will take people to their grave if I have to. I will do anything to protect these elephants.
No further questions.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. Redirect Ms. Gaskins.
No redirect, Your Honor. We rest our case in chief and ask that Mr. Kwong be able to step down.
And thank you, Mr. Kwong. You can step down at this time.
Thank you, Your Honor.
Anything further from the defense before we proceed to closing argument?
No, Your Honor.
Anything further from the government before we go to closing argument?
Your Honor, we would just like to draw the court's attention to Stipulation 18. This states that apart from financial transactions initiated by Kara Bassett through her power of attorney and her inheritance, there has been no financial activity concerning Don Clark's bank accounts, credit cards, real properties, or investments since August 18th of 2017. Other than that, we're ready to proceed to closing arguments.
And so stipulated, Ms. Gaskins.
Yes, Your Honor.
And I will remind our scorers to change to speaker view for closing arguments, which I will do as well. And then Ms. Goodchild, anytime you're ready.
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury. She waited. She waited until they were alone. She waited until it was dark. She waited until she had the opportunity. And then she struck. The defendant attacked her husband and injected an elephant tranquilizer into him. And then she took his body, drove 140 miles to a Tallahassee swamp, and then ditched him. And then she went home and got everything she ever wanted. This death didn't happen out of the blue. This kill was calculated. Now it's the defendant's actions that bring us here today. The government has brought a charge of murder against Kara Bassett. Now what that means is that in today's trial, we had to prove to you that the only reasonable explanation for what happened to Mr. Clark was that he was intentionally killed by his wife. Today we've done just that. So let's go through today's trial to see how the government has met its burden and to understand how this kill was calculated. Now you had a chance today to meet Special Agent Johnson. And he walked you through the investigation he conducted, but even more importantly, what happened to Mr. Clark on the night of August 18th. He told you that they saw that his van went from his house in the middle of the night all the way across Florida to that swamp. But even more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, he told us how there was direct evidence connecting the defendant. A place that the defendant, when asked, claimed she had never been. And that's important. Because what that means, members of the jury, is that the defendant was at the swamp the night her husband disappeared. We know how she did. You heard today that the defendant had access to an elephant tranquilizer, something that was used to sedate elephants and certainly strong enough to kill a man. You heard today from Agent Johnson that there was one syringe of this deadly poison unaccounted, something the defendant could never explain. Now, during her opening statement, Ms. Gaskins asked some questions. She asked what direct evidence we would have about Mr. Clark's death. And to some extent, members of the jury, we don't really have a body. We can't tell you exactly where that syringe is, that's true. But there's a reason for that. Because by the time the defendant actually reported her husband as missing to the FBI, over a week had passed. Think about that. If the defendant was the victim the defense would have you believe, don't you think she would have contacted them sooner? Don't you think she would have told anyone that the love of her life had vanished in the night and never returned? She didn't do that. What she did is she took his body to a swamp, waited for it to disappear, and then waited a week for the evidence to be gone. Because the kill was calculated. Now you may be asking why. Why would the defendants go to such lengths? Why would she hurt her husband? And what we heard today is that elephants weren't just the defendant's favorite animal. They were an obsession, a passion, something she had spent years arguing with her husband about, demanding changes for the elephants they had in their custody. And after her husband continued to refuse, she took matters into her own hands. Members of the jury, we don't even need to ask how far the defendant would go to protect these animals, because she told us. She told us that she would take people to their grave if she had to. And that's exactly what she did. Because after her husband disappeared, she got everything she ever wanted. Control of the elephant park, the ability and power to bring the changes she wanted. So after months of planning, she put her plan into action. Members of the jury, when you go back to deliberate, I want you to remember the physical evidence connecting the defendant to the scene of the crime. I want you to think about the opportunity that she had and the motivation that she was so confident in she put on camera. When you follow the evidence, you'll see that this kill was calculated. Find the defendant guilty of murder.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. And Ms. Gaskins, closing.
May it please the court. We don't have a body. We don't have the murder weapon, those syringes. They don't have an eyewitness. Well, Ms. Goodchild might as well say in her closing argument that she doesn't have any evidence either. When she gets up here and says that this kill was calculated. Sure, it may sound catchy. You may be compelled at first, but it doesn't prove her case. Over and over again today, she's been trying to prove to you that, for one, Don Clark is dead, and that, two, Miss Bassett killed him with elephant tranquilizer. But members of the jury, just because she says this kill was calculated over and over again doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean that she proved it, and surely it doesn't make it sound any less absurd. I mean, think about it. Did she actually prove that Don Clark is even dead? Is it possible that he could be alive in Costa Rica somewhere and we just don't know it? Yes. And that's reasonable doubt, and trust me, we'll get to that, but first. The problem with the government's case is that they chose their answer before they asked the questions. Now, when Miss Goodchild walked into this courtroom today, she was the one to accuse Miss Bassett of killing her own husband. That's serious, and that's why the law required her to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. Like we said in openings, the highest burden in our criminal justice system. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to those questions I asked about in the beginning. We're going to walk through all of the ways that the government failed to meet their burden. First, we're going to talk about how Miss Bassett didn't commit this crime and how the evidence doesn't suggest that she did. Second, we're going to talk about alternate explanations, things that could be true. And third, we're going to talk about how the FBI didn't bother to do a proper investigation. So first, how Miss Bassett didn't commit this crime. You see, it was the government's burden and their burden alone to prove to you that Miss Bassett intentionally and deliberately killed Don Clark. But think about it. Out of all of the evidence, all of the witnesses, the testimony that you heard today, nobody even told you that they were in an argument the day that he disappeared. Nobody told you that they ever saw Miss Bassett get violent with her husband. Nobody ever testified that they saw Miss Bassett behind the wheel of the van that Miss Goodchild wants you to believe is so important. And let's talk about those boots that she was wearing, because nobody even testified that Miss Bassett was wearing those boots the day her husband disappeared. You see, we do have to talk about something, and it's something that Miss Goodchild is hiding from you. Mr. Hudson, can you throw up the forensic report? Because she wants to talk about, oh, this algae, it matches the swamp, so she must have been there. But members of the jury, the government didn't even bother to take a single sample from her property. This woman works on an elephant farm. They didn't take a single sample from any of the swamps, any of the watering holes that were on her property. So is it possible that the algae on her boots could have matched her own house? Yes. Not to mention, there's no real motive. You see, Miss Goodchild, she wants you to make this leap in logic. She wants you to see, oh, they were arguing, they didn't like the way that they ran the park. So Miss Bassett is a killer. But what the government doesn't seem to understand is that married couples, they fight. Wives and their husbands get into arguments all the time, heated ones even. It's normal. If we put wives on trial, every time they got in an argument with their husbands, we'd have a backlog in our criminal justice system to last the rest of our lives. So when Miss Goodchild asks you to make these assumptions, these leaps in logic, that's when you have to remember that's not how this works. Because Miss Bassett, she has the presumption of innocence. So let's move to the biggest unanswered question in this case. Where is Don Clark? You see, you haven't even heard the answer to that question today, and here's why that's a problem. Autopsy proving he's dead. There's no eyewitnesses that prove he's dead. There's no blood. There's no decay. I mean, think about it. You have evidence on the record suggesting the opposite. The possibility that this man could still be alive in Costa Rica. Joe Kwong told you that flat out. So let's talk about what the government did about this. The evidence that they had, nothing. Absolutely nothing. I mean, let's start with the lead investigator on this case, Steph Johnson. I asked him a bunch of questions on cross-examination. He seemed to have a hard time answering them because, you know what? He chose his answer before he even asked the questions, and he didn't want you to see that on cross-examination. Think about the alternate suspects in this case. Mr. Hudson, can you throw up those telephone records for us? We have two people who were contacting the victim the same evening that he disappeared. His ex-wife, who was terrifying, and some person in Costa Rica where we know Don Clark has a property. Do they have alibis? No. The only person who even didn't cooperate with this investigation in the first place doesn't even have an alibi. They have no idea where Lisa Clark was the night that Don Clark disappeared. Is that suspicious? Yes. Is that reasonable doubt? Yes. So I'm going to ask you to come to the only conclusion that's supported by the lack of evidence. By the fact that the government, they chose their answer before they asked the hard-hitting questions that you need answers to. Because as of right now, you have no idea what happened to Don Clark the night he disappeared. Nobody really does. So find the defendant not guilty of murder. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Gaskins. And rebuttal from the government?
Yes, Your Honor. Members of the jury, we know exactly where Don Clark is. At the bottom of Big Gum Swamp. Now, a moment ago, Ms. Gaskins just told you that it's possible that Don Clark was out in Costa Rica, but we know that's not true. We can see that the defense is grasping at straws. Because when Mr. Kwong told you that he went to Costa Rica, sure, he found the house there, but he never saw Don Clark. In fact, both sides have agreed today that since August 18th of 2007, Mr. Clark's financial assets, bank accounts, all that haven't been touched. So in order for the defense's story to make sense, Mr. Clark would have had to flee the country in the middle of the night from Tallahassee, Florida, all the way to Costa Rica, with no one seeing that, no documentation, and had been living for 3 years past that without spending a dime. That's not reasonable doubt. Ms. Gaskins tried to tell you that maybe it was Lisa Clark who committed this crime. But our own witness told us that on August 18th, they never saw Lisa Clark. Mr. Clark never mentioned any fear for his ex-wife or that she had been threatening him that day. That's not reasonable doubt. Because it's just not reasonable. What the evidence in today's trial showed is that this kill was calculated. that the defendant stood to gain something she had wanted for years. And her husband was the only thing in her way. The kill was calculated. Hold her accountable for her actions and find the defendant guilty.
Thank you, Ms. Goodchild. And we'll give everybody a moment to submit their ballots, and I'll get my participant list up, and maybe scores. You can give me a thumbs up or something that shows up on the participant list to